Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Arun. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I must say I was so taken by that introduction that I hardly know what to say. If I had any sense, I probably wouldn't say anything. But I thank you for giving me the chance to address you. I wish I were there with you. As you know, I can't leave the United States now because Hillary's in a critical phase of her campaign. But I am delighted to have this chance to speak to you and to the India Today Conclave participants. I thank you for having me back, and I congratulate you on having Vice President Gore close the conclave. He won a well-deserved Nobel Prize for his lifetime commitment to doing something about global warming, and it's very, very important to the considerations that India and all of Asia have to make about how to grow their economy in the future. So I think you're going to have a great closing session. I understand that I'm supposed to talk for a few minutes today, and then we're going to have a few questions. So if you will, I'd just like to offer a few thoughts building on the themes that you mentioned at the end of your introduction. When I spoke to the India Today Conclave in 2003, I had the opportunity to say that we should build a world of positive interdependence, not negative interdependence, and that to do that, we had to deal with the challenges of building shared opportunities, creating shared responsibilities, giving the world and each nation a sense of shared community across all our divisions based on a set of basic values, the most important of which is that our differences are quite significant and they make life more interesting, but our common humanity matters more. In the years which have elapsed, in these 5 years, as we look back on them, we see an enormous amount of progress and significant and persistent peril, reminding us again that every nation and every region in this interdependent global environment is bedeviled by 3 problems. The first is persistent, enduring inequality. Inequality in employment and incomes, in access to education and health care. The second is the insecurity of the current circumstances because our interdependence means we have to be open to forces beyond our borders, both positive and negative, which include terror, the prospect of being exposed to dangerous nuclear, chemical, or biological materials, the danger of a global epidemic like avian influenza. And finally, the course that we're on is unsustainable because of the undeniable reality of global warming, which we see manifest over and over again in currently and rapidly changing circumstances in the global environment. So as we look ahead, we can celebrate the last 5 years and what it's done for India. I mean, look at the lives of the people at this conclave. Look at the enormous burst of creativity and strength and economic and political influence in India. Look at the generation of new wealth. Look at the fact that India now has the world's largest middle class. But here you see persistent inequality, continued sporadic violence, and you have to face the fact that global warming requires us to change the trajectory of growth in terms of our energy usage. Can we do these things? Can the positive elements of the interdependent world of the 21st century outweigh the negative ones? That is the great overarching question of our time. A lot of the specific elements and questions have to be answered by political leaders. That's why elections matter in the United States and India and everywhere else. But I spend a lot of my time asking and trying to answer the question of what civil society can do. What can we do, those of us who are private citizens, who are not in political power, who will never be in political power, but who have access to resources and human creativity in a world where the non-governmental sector is more influential than ever before. You certainly see this in India, where there are over 500,000 non-governmental organizations operating in very poor villages and funded by very wealthy individuals. You see it all over the country. In the United States, we have an amazing number of non-governmental groups, and half of them, have been established in this decade by people who believe that civil society can make a difference in tackling these big problems. And essentially what I try to do with my foundation and my work around the world is to take people's good intentions and turn them into reality in other people's lives. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit in terms of the challenges we face. And then when we come to the end of that, I know we're going to have a question and answer session, and I like those because at least I know in a question and answer session I'm talking about something that all of you are interested in instead of something that I'm interested in. Hopefully it'll be the same thing, but it isn't always. But let's just begin with the World Health Crisis. A quarter of all the people on Earth this year will die of AIDS, TB, malaria, and infections related to dirty water. Diarrhea, dysentery, cholera. 80% of the people in that last category will be children under 5. By and large, these are the diseases of the poor. To be sure, in the wealthy countries, there are people who have AIDS, but if they take the medicine properly and if they maintain their diet and exercise regime and do what they're supposed to do, most of them can live a reasonably normal life expectancy at reasonably high levels of health. The diseases of the poor ram home the inequality of the world. Working with indispensable partners in India, the great generic drug producers there, Ranbaxy, Cipla, and several other Indian companies, we have arranged to provide the world's least expensive high-quality AIDS medicine to adults and children all over the world. We're now serving 1.4 million people around the world. And that's an astonishing thing when you consider that just a couple of years ago, when we began this project in 2003, only 200,000 people in poor countries around the world who needed AIDS medicine to stay alive were getting it. And most of those were in Brazil and Thailand, where the government was providing the medicine. So we're serving about 1 million for people. The United States government program, I think, is serving about that number. The Global Fund on AIDS, TB, and Malaria is serving about that number. So we have come a long way. There's some overlap in those numbers, but we're coming closer to the goal of making sure that no poor person has to die of AIDS simply because they live in a poor country. And none of this would have been possible without a remarkable change in business strategy by the Indian pharmaceutical companies. And it's the sort of thing that we all ought to be thinking about in terms of how we can both do well in the world and do good. Because what the big companies decided to do with our help was to change their business strategy with regard to AIDS medicine. Instead of selling a relatively low volume of drugs with a relatively high profit margin per dose, we got them to go to very, very high volumes at lower profit margins. And that enabled a whole world to open up with the limited amount of funds that we had available to save people's lives. But I want to make it clear that no one I work with is ever asked to lose money. We always ask people to make a profit, but to do it in a different way. This is the sort of thing the non-governmental movement can do. And we have seen it dramatically with regard to children. A couple of years ago, when we started trying to provide pediatric AIDS medicine, only 10,000 children in the world who needed the low dose, different dose pediatric AIDS medicine were getting it, and 500,000 kids a year were dying of AIDS. Now we have over 300,000 children on this medicine because we lowered the price of children's pediatric AIDS medicine from $600 a person a year to $60 a person a year. Again, thanks in large measure to our partners in India. But they're still making money. They're just making money in a completely different way with very high volumes and low profit margins. That plus the work that we do in many countries in building health systems, building nutrition programs, doing AIDS prevention and education work has made a real difference, not only in India, but in many countries in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. We sell this medicine all over the world. Most of the medicine now is sold in 55 countries, but about 70 are eligible to buy it. So that's just one example of what we can do. Another big problem in the developing world with regard to healthcare is the absence of systems. We find this with health, with education, with economic development. So our foundation also tries to build functioning systems. If you think about how you all came to be there today, look, I can see you through the monitor. All of you are there having a nice dinner. You're going to drink that bottled water. You have absolutely no doubt that it's good water. You're going to have a good meal, and you have no doubt that the food is well prepared. You expect the sound equipment to work here. You take for granted that you'll be comfortable in that room. Most of those conditions are absolutely unavailable to a vast number of people in the world, where half the world's people live on less than $2 a day and 1 billion on less than $1 a day. And largely it's not because they're not intelligent and not because they're incapable of learning things, and certainly not because they don't work hard. It's because they do not have access to systems, the kinds of systems we take for granted that make the generation of wealth possible, that make comfortable lives possible, that make the very building blocks of a good life possible in terms of health and education and shelter. So my foundation does a lot of work to help build systems. We have 25 countries in Africa where we're actually trying to build the health systems from the ground up. We are working in 2 countries trying to build health, education, and economic systems simultaneously, with some of the lessons we learned in the AIDS Project, in our Clinton Hunter Development Initiative in Rwanda and Malawi. We have doubled and sometimes tripled farmers' income by doing what we did with AIDS drugs. We've lowered the cost of seed. We've lowered the cost of fertilizer. We've improved the distribution from farm to market. And we've had a remarkable success. And simultaneously, we've built healthcare systems from the ground up. This can be done all over the world, but in the end, I'm convinced it's one of the most important things the non-governmental system can do, to empower people at the local level to create their own systems so that there is a real connection between the effort they exert and the results they achieve. We're now attempting to do it on a much larger scale, beginning in Latin America, then ultimately going to Asia and going to Africa and countries where mining occurs. The mining industry is one of the few industries that you can be absolutely sure will increase its profitability in every year between now and the year 2050, because the world's population is projected to grow from its current level of 6.5 billion to 9 billion. We can slow that a little bit if we could get all the girls in the world in school, and that's another thing I'm trying to do. But even so, we could only take maybe 1 billion off that number. There will be more people in the world in 2050 than there are now. And we have to do something to try to deal with that. But meanwhile, miners will make more money because they'll have to take more things out of the ground for all the people that will be living in the world. More and more of these big mining companies are concerned that when they close up shop and move away, the people they leave behind will have nothing to live on. And the land may not be well cared for, depending on what the local government regulations are. So we have put together a consortium of 24 mining companies seeded with $300 million to try to build sustainable economies for the long run, environmentally responsible economies with good jobs, good healthcare systems, and good education systems in mining communities across the world, beginning in Colombia, Peru, and Mexico, and eventually spreading out to mining communities in Asia and Africa. It's very exciting. We already have about 26 companies signed on, but again, we're trying to build systems. Will we be successful? I can't be sure, but I am absolutely sure that we're working on the right things. We work only in partnerships with governments. We don't try to be at cross purposes with them, but we know that in many of these developing countries, the governments simply do not have the capacity on their own to build the kind of systems that have made the success of all of you in the room possible. And I think it's very important that we try to do that whenever we can. So I'm working on that. Finally, let me just say a word about the sustainability issue. I believe that global warming is a real and persistent problem. I do not believe it will be addressed unless we can prove that we can change our energy patterns and essentially move into a post-carbon future in a way that is good for the economy, not just of the wealthy countries, not just the United States and Europe and Japan, but especially of the emerging countries, and particularly of China and India, but also
Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, all the other emerging economies. If we cannot prove that you can change the pattern of energy usage in a way that is good economics, then I don't think anything we do in America or Europe or Japan will make any difference. I think the planet will be irrevocably damaged by mid-century, and our children and grandchildren will live a much reduced life. So the question is, can we do this? And the answer is, nobody knows for sure, but I think so. And I devote a lot of my time now to working with cities around the world, proving that there are things you can do on energy, on water management, that will make a real difference and actually boost economic growth. Our climate change initiatives works with 40 cities on 6 continents to prove that it's good economics over the long run to save the planet for our children and grandchildren. We work in Paris, for example, where we're retrofitting 660 elementary schools. We're going to save energy, cut the cost of the school budget, train lots of people for new jobs, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're doing the same thing in New York City with the Public Housing Authority, where we're going to cut the annual electric bill from $500 million a year to $350 million a year, train hundreds of low-skilled workers who are presently unemployed or underemployed in green-collar jobs to do the work at these buildings, give the City Housing Authority more money to take care of poor people, and cut our greenhouse gas emissions substantially. This kind of thing can be done all across the world. We're working in the city of Houston, our 3rd biggest city, where the mayor has retrofitted the homes of the poorest 20% of his city citizens and cut their utility bills 20%. We're saving the planet and making poor people richer by having more disposable income. And again, we trained a lot of new workers. We're working in Delhi and Mumbai in India, primarily on building efficiency, trying to cut energy usage and clean the environment in that way. But over the long run, there are lots of other things that have to be done. We're working on water management systems. It's a huge issue in Delhi. And we're hoping we can help improve the waste management systems in a way that both improves the energy situation and improves public health and the quality of life. I believe these kinds of investments are very important, and the Indian government's committed quite an amount of money to these kinds of investments in the future. But I believe that India has enormous potential in solar energy, in wind energy, in tidal energy, to build a clean energy future, to build an efficient future, and to find jobs for a lot of people in smaller areas, in rural areas, who don't have jobs, and a lot of people who are coming to the big cities without sufficient employment. If you think about it, changing India's energy future will actually complement the high-tech sources of economic growth you've had in the last few years and broaden economic opportunity. The current government in India, after all, was elected after the country had enjoyed 9% growth for several years, but it had been largely confined to 35% of the population. The government's commitment was to spread that growth to the other 65%. The easiest way to do that is by changing the way you generate energy, by localizing it, by making the country more energy independent, and by using the matters at hand, using the sun, using the wind, using the tidal energy along the coast, particularly along the Indian Ocean where the tides are quite strong, and by maximizing energy efficiency in lighting and heating and building materials. There are all kinds of things that can be done, and there are millions and millions of jobs to be created in doing it. The same thing is true in China. If you look at China, they're bringing on a new coal-fired power plant every 10 days. If they continue to do that, their growth and yours alone are almost sufficient to tip the scales in the global warming battle. Now, you can't tell people not to use coal, so therefore we have to find a way to take the carbon dioxide out of the coal in the process and either burn it up or put it underground. The only place this is being done on a large scale is in Norway, where carbon emissions are being taken out of oil burning and put under a rock shelf in the North Sea. It is very thick rock. It's not porous. The emissions will not escape. And of course, the North Sea is very heavy. That cave, which is vacuum packed now against leaking, has enough capacity to store Europe's carbon dioxide for the rest of this century. And so you see people in the Netherlands and other countries, for example, trying to think of how they can build piping to send their carbon emissions to store them under the sea. We have to find places like that all over the world, or change the process by which coal is turned into energy usable for electricity for people. These are the kinds of things we're working on. There are lots of things that can be done in transportation. Every country could become virtually energy independent in transportation. The only thing we know we need oil for today is to produce jet diesel fuel. No one has yet figured out how to take a heavy airplane, lift it off the ground, and fly it a long way at a fast speed without using an oil derivative product. But every other time we use oil to travel, it is optional. So if I were, for example, in charge of this in India, I would be trying to modernize the rail system. I would be trying to accelerate the production of the natural gas-powered vehicles like those that are now regularly used around the Taj Mahal to reduce local air pollution there. I would be looking for all kinds of other things that can be done. We are very close to developing a car which gets 100 miles to the gallon in America with a lithium battery that will run on electricity to 55 miles an hour and then kick over into fuel. Today, there's insufficient material to produce these batteries in a large volume, and because they can't be produced in large volume, we can't drive the price down. Many of you in the audience know far better than I that all electrical products drop dramatically in price as their volume goes up, but we're getting close there. And our foundation is working in all these areas, but especially in the buildings area where a non-governmental organization can have a great impact. You simply organize people to finance these improvements out of lower electric bills, and we can create millions of jobs on every continent. So I'm working in India. If you have any ideas, if you want us to help, if you think you can help us, I would welcome that. But I do believe we can take the future you are building away from your children and grandchildren unless we do something serious about climate change. Finally, let me say, I have tried to find ways to involve other people far beyond our foundation in this non-governmental work. The most important thing we do, I think, is the Clinton Global Initiative, which meets every year at the opening of the United Nations, where we bring in business and political leaders, non-governmental leaders from all over the world. We discuss at most 3 or 4 problems every year, and we tell everyone who comes if they want to come back, they have to make a commitment to actually do something. And the results have been quite encouraging. We've had about $30 billion in commitments from over 1,000 people and groups, affecting 100 million people in over 100 countries in the last 3 years, just trying to build this great non-governmental movement, not only in the areas that I mentioned today, but in other areas that people are interested in. I think that India, with its heritage, its rich and deep heritage of non-governmental organizations, may be in the best position to devise localized solutions for a lot of these problems with an even bigger and an even better funded non-governmental movement. So that's the other thing I would ask all of you to look at. In May, in Hong Kong, we're going to have a global initiative meeting in Asia for the first time, focusing just on the major challenges facing Asia and what the private sector and all this new generation of wealth in Asia can do to address these problems, working not in opposition to government, but hopefully in partnership with government, but in places where the government clearly is not and perhaps cannot address these problems adequately. So we're going to be meeting there in May. Perhaps some of you in the audience will be there, or perhaps you're interested in coming. If you are, you could let me know, and I'll try to work that out. But this is a very exciting world we're living in. There are more people generating more wealth and more opportunity than ever before. But those of us who have it have a huge responsibility to plow some of it back into the future so that our children and all our children can enjoy these benefits. We are still a long way from a world of shared benefits, shared opportunities, shared responsibilities. A long way from a world where we reach across all the divisions and build a global community and genuine communities within all our nations. The progress to me is immensely encouraging. I am far more optimistic than pessimistic, but I don't think we can deny the searing impacts of inequality and what it does to diminish the potential of a country like India. I don't think we can deny the troubling insecurity that still exists in the world today because of the conflicts that you see most pronounced in the Middle East, but everywhere else in the world, on every continent. And I know we can't deny the fact that we could be depriving our grandchildren of building on all the work that you have done if we don't do something about global warming. So this is an exciting time to be alive, a heady time to be filled with lots of interesting things to work on, whether you're in politics or business, or if you're in the non-governmental sector. There's plenty to do every morning to keep us busy, to keep us worried, but also to keep us hopeful. On balance, I am quite optimistic about the future, but we have to deal with these big challenges. And we can't expect the government to do it all. There's simply not the capacity out there to do it or the political support to do it. But ironically, it has been my experience in all these countries where I'm working that the more the non-governmental sector does and the more we prove that these problems can be solved, the better government policies we get. These two things work hand in hand. And that's one of the reasons that I'm quite hopeful about the future and quite grateful for the chance to address such a distinguished group in India today. Thank you so much.
Let me just say that perhaps you can tell us what are the issues there in the American presidential election which you think are going to lead to somebody winning it? When you were running it, you made the economy an issue. What do you think is the big issue there?
Well, today, first of all, let me explain what Arun meant so that you won't think that we're being just cute here. I have to be very careful in this meeting not to do anything to advocate for my candidate's cause, or that would be a violation of American election laws. And I'm very sorry about that, but I can tell you what the landscape is. The problems in America today, the dominant issue has become the economy, although the war in Iraq and our standing in the world generally are of great concern as well. So unlike 1992, where the issue was how to bring back the American economy and how to make the most of our relationships in the world at the end of the Cold War, today the issue is, again, how to bring back the American economy and how to restore America's standing as a major force for peace as well as security and for cooperation on solving our common problems. And Iraq is only a part of that. But the American people know that, and there's also a great disillusionment in the way our government has worked here. Majorities of Americans believe that national government over the last few years has been too dominated by organized, powerful interests, and that has choked off a lot of things that might have been done in the public interest. So in the lexicon of American politics, people use the word change all the time, but when they talk about change, if you ask them, that's normally what they mean. They want to rebuild the foundations of the middle-class economy that makes every young American believe that he or she can have the life of their dreams, that give poor people a chance to work their way into the middle class, and that give a middle-class lifestyle some measure of security and stability. In the United States today, as compared with the 1990s when I served, we had 22.9 million jobs then, only 5 million today. We had almost 8 million Americans working their way out of poverty into the middle class. In this decade, we've had 5 million people moving from the middle class into poverty. We had family incomes going up about $7,500 a year, median family incomes, after inflation. In this decade, after inflation declining $1,000 a year. About 90% of the benefits of this decade, economic benefits, have gone to the top 10% of our earners. Almost half of that to the top 1%, a big chunk of that to the top 1/10 of 1%. So America is growing more unequal. And the stagnant incomes of the middle class have created great anxiety because the cost of health care in our country has doubled. The cost of an education after high school, a college education, has gone up 75%. Everything related to energy is exploding. Even food now is going up at more than twice the rate of inflation, when America, because of its vast capacity to produce food,
has always, or in recent history, always enjoyed low food prices. So there's a lot of anxiety in the American electorate. And that has led to a lot of talk that you've probably noticed in India. There's been a lot of campaigning against trade, against immigration, against outsourcing. And you have to understand that all that is more intense in this decade than it was when I served, for the simple reason that the average American is broke at the end of every month. They can't pay their bills. They don't know if they're going to be able to educate their kids. They're worried about losing their health insurance. So these economic issues are at the very heart of the campaign. But the American people are also very concerned that our country seems to have been alienated from the world. And more of them understand it's not just about the war in Iraq, because even the United Nations is pulling for Iraq to succeed as a unified country. No one wants it to fail. We don't want a third war in the Middle East. We don't want another operating ground for al-Qaeda. We don't want yet another place from which the Middle East peace that we still hope can be reached between the Palestinians and the Israelis could be sabotaged. But there are lots of other problems. The United States, after I left office, withdrew from the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. At the same time, we were telling Iran and North Korea we didn't want them to have nuclear weapons. I agree with that, by the way. But we withdrew from the treaty and tried to develop 2 new tactical nuclear weapons. That's a pretty hard sell, to tell other countries, we don't want you to have one of what we have 1,500 of, and we'd like to have 2 more of. And that alienated a lot of people in the world. We withdrew from the International Criminal Court against war crimes after our soldiers in combat and others had been explicitly protected against political trials. We withdrew from the Kyoto Accord on climate change and told everybody else, we sure hope you'll do something about global warming, but we're not willing to make a commitment on it. That was, I believe, a bad mistake. So many people in the world began to think that America wanted one set of rules for itself and another set for everyone else. And I think that what we have to do is to reestablish a message that America is back in the cooperation business, that we want to cooperate with other countries whenever we can and act alone only if there's no other alternative, because we actually have no serious problems that any country can solve on its own. We can't solve global warming, we can't solve terrorism, we can't solve the threat of nuclear materials, we can't solve global epidemics, we can't solve massive flows of illegal immigrants, human trafficking, narco-trafficking, the spread of organized crime units across the globe. None of these things can be solved by countries acting on their own. So this is America knows this instinctively, and I think there's a huge majority in our country that wants to see us back in the cooperation business, that wants to see us back in the diplomacy business, using diplomacy first with friend and foe alike, and military force only as an absolute last resort. So I would say the big issues are those surrounding the economy, which include the generation of jobs, the generation of an energy-independent, clean energy future, the provision of affordable health care to all of our people. All these things are wrapped in this great middle-class crisis we see in America today, dealing with our home mortgage crisis. And then there's a second set of issues that are not as important but are profoundly significant in this election, which relate to America's role in the world and how it should be changed.
If I may just follow up the one on economy, because what one hears in the American election is a lot of voices talking about protectionism. I think you also raised it, but during your presidency, you were signed NAFTA, you believed in open borders. So there was a movement towards the open economy. So now we hear more protectionist voices. We hear democratic voices against outsourcing, which of course affects India. Perhaps you can elaborate on that. Is America mood changing towards that? Are they getting more isolationist in that sense because of the economy?
They are, but the answer is to give them an alternative, give the American people an alternative future that actually generates jobs and incomes. If you were an American living in the middle of the country on $40,000 a year or $30,000 a year, and you were trying to raise 2 or 3 kids,
and you hadn't had a raise in 7 years, and your town had generated no new employment, you might be more protectionist too. Everybody looks for reasons for why the economy has gone down. There is really only one trade-related fact that I think is important, and that is trade enforcement has gone down. And the global move that was being made when we had the meeting in Seattle in 1999, I thought we were about to start a global movement to put basic labor and environmental standards into all of our trade agreements, something the labor movement wants not just for protectionist reasons, but to lift people out of horrible working conditions in developing countries. The recognition that we have a global financial system and a global trading system, but not a global social network to try to lift people's economic conditions. I thought that was well underway. And then when the current government came in America, they did not believe in putting labor and environmental standards in all these agreements. That fed a lot of protectionism because most people in my party who believe in trade also believe in labor and environmental standards. And the other big thing that happened is America went back to trickle-down economics, that is, trying to have big tax cuts and subsidies for the wealthiest Americans and entities, corporate entities, and going back to big budget deficits. And that plus our trade deficit meant we had to borrow a lot of money every day. And it's very interesting that the countries with whom we have the biggest trade deficits in order, China, Japan, Korea, and the oil exporters, are also the countries which loan us the most money every single day to cover tax cuts for people in my income group, to pay for our soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, to pay for the ongoing operations of the government. Now, that's not their fault, that's America's fault. We made a decision. If we had stayed on the budget trajectory that I left, running surpluses every year, we would have taken care of the retirement cost of the baby boom generation. We would be virtually out of debt today. Instead, we went back to what I think are more selfish and short-sighted policies, which added $4 trillion to the national debt and required us to borrow massive sums every day from the same countries that have big trade surpluses with us. So we have virtually no trade enforcement anymore. When I was president, I was a big free trade president, but I also enforced the agreements if I thought they weren't fair, and that gave Americans a sense that it was a more or less level playing field. Now trade enforcement is 1/5 what it was when I was president, and it's obvious why. You cannot be very tough on your bankers, and we have to borrow the money every single day to keep the doors of America open because we abandoned financial responsibility. So one of the sort of underlying issues in the American election this year is whether we should seriously get back to fiscal responsibility in our government and trying to do more for ourselves. And I think that, no one can blame another country for that. America made the decision to get back in the borrowing business, to throw away the stability we could have had in our Social Security and other systems for the baby boomer retirements. It was a terrible, terrible mistake, I believe. But it is aggravating the economic insecurity of the middle class. And as I said, I don't think you should think of this as a permanent condition, because when people are out there just struggling to pay their bills every month, they're looking for some explanation for why they're not better off. So if they have a call center, for example, that moves from South Dakota to India, they think that's a bad thing. You would think that's a bad thing if you lived in South Dakota too. You wouldn't seem nearly as bad if you'd gotten 500 more jobs from some other source at the same time and your income was going up every year. So the American people are in a tough place right now, and they're asking for some changes. But I think the most important thing is there will be some changes in trade policy, but I think the candidates have all spoken to what their positions are. But I think the most important thing we have to recognize is America has to create more jobs, and that's what you should want too, because we can do more business with you if we're generating more wealth at home, if we have more employment at home, if people are moving into the consumer class in the United States. That's the fundamental core problem of the American economy, and one that I hope this election will produce an answer to.
What you're saying, President Clinton, is in fact that it's politically expedient right now to go and say that we'll protect our trade and get away from free trade, but that really is a short-term solution. And about outsourcing, is there anything that the government can really
Well,
do?
wait.
Right.
No, politically expedient implies that the people who are saying what they're saying don't mean it. And there's one campaign that's gotten in a lot of trouble by acknowledging that. I think everything that, I think you have to assume that these candidates intend to make the changes in trade policy they talk about. But if you look at it, neither of the Democratic candidates has proposed, repealing our broad trade agreements or withdrawing from the World Trade Organization, or, basically ending the international economic system. But what they are saying is that they want to try to make the system work better for average people in our country and average people in other countries. But I'm just pointing out that while I think that they actually, at least with the candidate I know, believes in what she has said in terms of the changes, the specific changes that ought to be made, the larger part of her economic message, and I think others, has to be, what are you going to do to create jobs? Because almost every country still generates most of its economic activity internally. So that if you don't have in a wealthy country particularly, in the United States and Europe and Japan, and all the wealthiest countries, if they don't have a source of new jobs every 5 to 8 years, the protectionist sentiments will increase. And I think the United States has historically, I think you would have to admit, been more open and its markets more penetrable than either Europe or Japan. And we've been able to do it largely because we have found those sources of new jobs. In this decade, if you look around the world at all the wealthiest countries, the countries that have done the best at generating more jobs, at raising incomes, and at reducing inequality are the countries that made a serious commitment to energy independence through clean energy and energy efficiency. Look at Denmark's experience. It's a small country, but they grew their economy 50% with zero increase in energy use. Meanwhile, they converted to over 25% of their electricity being generated from wind. Look at Sweden, a country with quite high taxes, but they're going to beat their Kyoto Protocol climate change targets. They've generated quite a lot of employment. Look at the United Kingdom, the European country most like America's in the organization of its economy. Unlike America, they have more jobs, rising incomes, and no increase in inequality. Why? Because they're going to beat their climate change targets under the Kyoto Protocol, meeting them by 2010, 2 years earlier, and then required, and then they'll be way ahead by 2012. That's why they're growing. So if America had done that, I think you would still see some calls for minor changes in our trade policy. They would probably not be as insistent as they are now. But I think the trade changes that have been proposed do not amount to a wholesale lunge into protectionism. They're an attempt to balance the scales a little bit. But I would just say that the number one thing the United States has to do, that you should want the United States to do, is to start generating income again, income growth and job growth. And ironically, the only way that any other rich country's been able to do it is by doing what's best for our children and grandchildren, and that's going to a clean, independent energy future.
Could you make a short comment on outsourcing? What is your opinion on that? Can it really be controlled from America? And will anything be done in this current atmosphere with the new presidency, if it's a Democratic president?
The only thing I have heard discussed about that in this campaign is, as far as I know, no candidate has claimed that anyone should be prohibited in doing whatever they want with their own property and wealth. But there are a couple of provisions of the American tax code which actually make it more attractive in some cases to move some employment offshore. It would actually apply more to factory production than the typical outsourcing you have in India, like call centers and things like that. But two, maybe even all three candidates, I don't know what Senator McCain said about this, have said that the American tax code should be made neutral on this so that there should be no tax incentives for outsourcing. I don't think the Congress ever intended to do this, but the way the tax code works today in America for corporations
it actually can be advantageous from a tax point of view to outsource jobs. And the candidates in our party have said that that should be changed. Senator Kerry said that 4 years ago too, and it hasn't been done. But that's our party's position, and I don't consider that to be a protectionist position. I think that's just a sensible position, that there are provisions of the tax code that were never intended to operate to encourage people to outsource jobs. That should be made, people should be free to do whatever they want with their property, and no one has called for a ban on it or legal restrictions on it, but there have been calls to make sure the tax code is neutral on the subject and not actually pro-outsourcing.
Before I open up to the floor, you've talked a lot about clean energy, and one of the big issues here is, in fact, the nuclear deal which the Bush administration has offered India. What is your view on this nuclear deal? Is it good for India? Would we get the same deal from a Democratic president? How do you view this nuclear deal which is between India, and a nuclear deal which is being discussed between India and America?
Well, I think first of all, I think the cooperation is good. I think the prospect of, if India wants to produce nuclear energy for the purpose of electrical power, from a greenhouse gas point of view, it's a good deal as long as you make sure you know what you're going to do with the nuclear waste, and you consider the energy balance involved in mining the uranium and then fixing the mining area and doing all the associated costs. I think that the deepening cooperation between our two countries is good. There was a lot of concern in the nonproliferation community in the United States about whether it went far enough on nonproliferation, but I think in general, when new governments come in, even if there's a change in party, they tend to honor the agreements of the previous administration. And there is in the Democratic Party, there's an enormous amount of support for the rapprochement between our two countries, which began in my term and has continued under the Bush administration. It's one area where our policies have been pretty much consistent. I think there are some people in our party who have questions about the details of this document, but I think that in general they support it, and they support the idea that we ought to cooperate in this area. And I hope that it can be the foundation of a whole new wave of cooperation across South Asia. I think the Indian government is to be commended. Mr. Singh has done what he could in a very unstable situation in Pakistan to try to figure out how to improve relations there. And I hope after the elections settle down, that there will be an opportunity for continued rapprochement there. I've always believed that if the Bangladeshis could solve their internal problems, and India and Pakistan could reconcile their differences over Kashmir and stop putting so much money into defense, that the Indian subcontinent could become the most rapidly growing part of the world and could provide a ballast, a bulwark against the idea that we cannot eliminate poverty with a global market system, that we cannot solve most of our problems. So I'm very hopeful about this, and I think this agreement is a part of that.